And thank you to David Wyman for bringing along his Tesla. He's a local from up the road from me. So he can talk about his experience driving Tesla. All right, I'll leave it up to Bryce. And I should have said, after a short break outside, we'll come back and John will entertain. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and my apologies to everyone for not being able to be there, but you're probably all very pleased that I'm not coming down and sharing the COVID joy. So it's this was sort of a last-minute thing to be able to do this today, but I'm hoping it'll work quite well. I've unfortunately had to do a lot of Zoom presentations in the last 2 years, so I've sort of got used to them by now. I was hoping that I wouldn't be doing a lot more though. So I'll pop this up as a share screen and put that on presentation mode. And can you all see that comfortably?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, fantastic. So I'll roughly run through, you've basically done my little intro as to who I am. And I do always add the bit about the former internal combustion engine, ICE to EV converter repairer. I don't do them anymore. I used to work on what were quite commonly blade electron converted Hyundai Getzes, and I think I have post-traumatic stress disorder every time I see one now because they cause me that much pain and work. So they always went back on the road again, but I'm not quite sure I had a few dozen more grey hairs every time. Anyway, this is what I'm covering today, and I'll talk about sort of the EV transition in general as well. So first up, the EV transition is not just electric cars, although that's what I'll be talking about today. It covers trucks. By the way, in these slides, all but 2 of these vehicles you can already buy. Of the 2, one of them is available to order, and there's only one of them that isn't actually available to buy or order. So I'll be interested to see if anyone can guess what it is. I'll leave it to Mark to ask a question maybe at the end of the presentation. By the way, it's probably easy to do questions at the end in this particular format than normally I would take them as I went through. Trucks, and we have machinery. Yes, Bobcat have recently announced a full electric Bobcat, and Sandvik have announced a number of large EV moving machinery, as in earth moving machinery. We've all seen bicycles, and for those of us living in town, you've probably almost been run over several times by the food delivery ones. Yes, you can buy electric motorbikes, and I have seen electric Harley Davidsons called the Livewire several times at the Swinburne DC fast charger. There are in fact electric planes around. That's a electric flight trainer, and that's in fact there's a fleet of them over in WA at the moment. They're made overseas, but the key point is that you can actually buy an EV flight. And Norway have in fact said all short haul flights by 2040 must be electric. You can actually buy a flying car in America. That thing there is a vertical takeoff and landing single person vehicle. It's quite amazing. What's called a black fly, if you wanted to look it up on the web, and they do envisage it ultimately becoming an autonomous drone type thing that you could just hop in and it'll take you to your destination. Autonomous forms, I'll shortcut the quiz at the end. That's the only one of these you can't buy, although that is actually made here in Australia, in Croydon, Victoria. That will be ultimately autonomous. It's got a steering wheel and pedals at the moment, but it's actually on test overseas. Yeah, electric buses, that's the sleeper in terms of electric vehicles, because there are tens of thousands of them arriving in various cities around the world. The Carbon 40 or C40 network of cities is in fact promising by 2025 to have only electric buses in all their new orders. Strange enough that no Australian city is a member of the C40, although Auckland, Rio de Janeiro, Paris, and a number of other small towns are part of it. And yes, there are electric ferries around. Amusingly, when New South Wales announced that they were moving to all electric public transport in terms of carbon neutral electricity buying, they said, oh yeah, we would look at doing ferries and maybe some of the smaller ones, but if we did with any of the big ones, they'd probably sink under the weight of the batteries. They obviously hadn't seen one of these because that's got about 30 car capacity, 300 passenger, and actually runs up in Norway. In fact, I think there's a dozen more of them on order. Okay, so when is the transition noticed? That's what we're facing at the moment. For those of you young and old, will have seen some or all, or probably not all of these, but as new technology comes in that we haven't seen before, This is a sort of uptake curve. Starts off slowly, ratchets right up to almost total saturation, and then levels off at the end. And as you can see, right at the very start, the flush toilet. It basically took a life of its own. Running water even. All of these things, the things we're more familiar with, the cellular phone, air conditioning, let's see, a smartphone, tablets, all of those things follow that curve. And I would say that EVs are part of that. We'll be following that same curve because, let's see, 7 years ago, oh, sorry, I'll do this one first. This is what happened with the first vehicle transition. In April 1900, as you can see on the left, and I've shamelessly swiped this from Tony Sieber's presentation, although he happily swiped it from these particular pictures, so I've gone back to original sources. But he made the point that in 1900 in New York Fifth Avenue, this photo included one horseless carriage, one car sitting there with a blue circle around it, and all the rest were horses and carriages. 13 years later, so effectively now, in 1913, one horse and carriage, and the rest were petrol cars. That's how fast this sort of transition can happen. And notice how many more cars there are than there were horses and carriages, because the car was turned out to be so popular. So in 2015, this was the next slide I was about to refer to, the predictions were that in Europe, electric cars would make up perhaps 4.5% of all new car sales. I'll let you go through the rest of those numbers at a later date. By the way, these slides are available if you email me using the email address at the end of the presentation. So just don't panic trying to write notes and things. I'm happy to send them through. However, they said about 4 to 5, maybe 4.5, a bit over by 2021. So basically the end of last year's figures. What happened is that, and if you look closely, Europe's hit about 9%, or just coming up to 9%, and is already passing that this year. Global, I should say, is hitting that. Europe's coming up to around 6.75%. So they've already outstripped those percentages. So the transition is happening faster than people originally predicted, and is probably going to go faster again as it climbs that exponential curve. So I always use a lot of acronyms, as do everybody in the EV field. So just to clarify what I'll be using through this presentation, I say a BEV is a battery electric vehicle. That's the simplest electric vehicle. It has a battery, an electric motor, and an electric motor turns into a generator when you're slowing down and puts some energy back into the battery. And it and its cousin, the PHEV, are the two plug-in electric vehicles, the PHEVs. The plug-in electric vehicle basically uses a smaller battery and couples that with a internal combustion engine, the ICE referred there, and therefore gives you a shorter range under battery, but a longer range overall with the petrol or diesel as it may be. Although it does have 2 drivetrains, it does need 2 sets of servicing. So it does actually need, it doesn't actually save you a lot in servicing, because that saving is lost in the petrol motor that's included in that particular package. And unfortunately, some of the manufacturers decided that they were a good game to play with the statistics and the ways of measuring the fuel economies. So they actually started putting smaller and smaller batteries in them. The Holden Volt, for instance, had quite a nice range of about 80 Ks or so when they came in. In fact, I saw a current Holden Volt owner walking just towards the end there. So you can ask Paul Fallon. He can wave his hand up the front there. He has actually got a Holden Volt, and you can ask him about his car. But then they started making them smaller and smaller because they could game the system to get really good stats and really good credits for their more polluting cars that they were selling. Because in other overseas countries, you get credits or fines for selling overly polluting vehicles overall numbers. Anyway, so the plug-in hybrids are included in that, and they got down to silly numbers like 12 kilometre range or less. And they've changed the standards again, and the batteries are getting bigger. So if you're wondering why the plug-in hybrids are getting longer ranges again, that's why. Now, the next one across is the hybrid electric vehicle, and they're the ones that you first saw when the Toyota Priuses came along, and the current Toyota Camrys, that type of thing. And they basically are a fuel saving measure rather than a true electric vehicle, because you can't charge them up with a plug. They're only run on petrol. So if you run out of petrol, you stop. And in fact, in the coming internal combustion engine bans that I'll talk about in a later slide, they're included as a petrol or a internal combustion engine car, and they cannot be sold after the end sales dates. Fourth one there is generally or commonly called the hydrogen car, but it is still an electric car because it uses hydrogen in a chemical reaction to create the electricity and does much the same thing as a hybrid electric vehicle. It needs the battery to do the regenerative braking because the hydrogen can't be regenerated within the car, and the fuel cell that basically provides the electricity can't easily ramp up or down quickly, so they need the battery to give you the instant acceleration and what you like. And that used to be the 4 types of vehicle that all the people in the EV world talked about. And then Hyzon trucks came along and recently announced that they're experimenting and starting to build here in Victoria, as well as some countries overseas, the fuel cell plug-in electric vehicle. So I put that one in. It's an experimental truck. They may or may not grow. We shall have to see. But there are now 5 types of electric vehicle, and they have a hydrogen and a plug as well. Okay, what is an EVSE, or more commonly called a car charger? First up, there are the AC ones. So that's your household power supply type ones. The one on your, I'm trying to think what it should be, you're facing, that sort of be your left, top left, is basically the one that comes normally with most cars. When you buy them new, they come in with a plug-in electricity cable, and that will supply your car from a 10 amp power point. You can also buy aftermarket ones that can be adapted right up to 32 amp 3-phase plugs, and depending on the power of the plug and the power that the car can accept, it'll do up to 22 kilowatts. So I'll talk a little bit more about watts in a minute, but that plug-in one does about the usual power point, 2.4 kilowatts or 10 amps. That one at the bottom will do 3-phase, 32 amps per phase if your car can take it. That middle green and white one is the sort of one that councils like to put in because they have no lead attached and you bring your own lead. So they called it BYO lead EVSE or EV charger, and you plug your own lead in, and that'll do up to 3-phase 32 amps comfortably and have a nice socket, depending on whether they connect it to 32 amp 3-phase or 32 amp single phase. Obviously single phase will charge at 1/3 the speed. That's the speed you would do at home, and I'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. Most of you have seen or heard of the Tesla chargers, and they have, that's the more common tethered lead because it's got a lead tethered to the charger. And I always say for home use, buy a tethered lead. They're a far more convenient box to use. Councils and things like the untethered or the BYO leads, because they don't have to look after the lead and they have to test it and tag it and repair it when people drive over it after they've left. As you've seen what people do with the tyre pressure gauges at petrol pumps, they rarely wrap them around the lead, the post as they should. They just leave them on the ground. And the same thing happens to leads. So generally councils don't put a lead on them anymore. Then after the AC types, you get the DC types. These are the true chargers. These are the ones that you see on the highways between the intercity capitals. And the one on your sort of right, but the left of the right, the orange one, is actually built here in Australia by Tritium. And they're working on, that will be a 50 kilowatt charger, and that at DC rates. And that will charge a car, my Kona, for instance, in just under or just over an hour. And if you're using the big green one there, the Azia Brown Bouverie one, that will do up to 350 kilowatts. And for an Ionic 5, that will charge to 80% in about 17.5 minutes. And there are now cars coming out with even faster charging times. That one, by the way, I won't talk about that one yet. The charging speeds are on the next slide. First, the slide after this one. I often also get asked about the term bidirectional charging, or V2X or V2G. First up, V2L is vehicle to load. So I can plug a lead through just an ordinary 10 amp, 15 amp lead into my car via an adapter, and it will charge or run any appliance I like, just 240 volts. Very handy for camping because you could take your portable, what should I call it, sort of waving my hands in midair, I'm sure you can see me. What do you call those, induction cooktops, things like that, so you can go away for a good glamping weekend. You can have a V2H, vehicle to home, so that provides power behind the meter. So if the power fails, a changeover switch will flick over and it'll power the house, or you can selectively do that and run the house off the car battery rather than off the grid, and just use up that power rather than use grid power. So if you've got a fully charged car from the solar over the day, you can then flick over to the car overnight, and you may never use any power off the grid unless it's been a dull day for several days or you've used the car a lot. And the third layer, the next one in the group, is V2G, the one that everyone seems to talk about. is vehicle to grid. So you can actually feed out to the grid just like a current solar PV system. And altogether, they're called V2X. They started off calling it V2G, and then they started coming up with these other layers. So they said, okay, the three of them are V2X. So that's where that comes from. Currently, and what's the state of play here? Only CHAdeMO, that big round plug, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but I'm waving it around it. On the left of that leaf charging inlet area is called a CHAdeMO socket, and that is a big chunky plug, and that was invented by the Tokyo Electric Power Company, Mitsubishi and Nissan early in the piece, and it was designed from the very beginning to do vehicle to output, so being able to provide emergency power, because Japan being on a or subject to tsunamis and other earthquakes and what have you, they're rather keen to have backup power systems. They designed it around that. However, CHAdeMO lost the plug war. Plug war was won by the CCS, the combined charging system. So if you see that socket on the right of my Nissan picture there, that's the AC half, the AC plug. And what CCS did is they combined the AC and the DC into one plug, much smaller, much easier, and the manufacturers loved it because they didn't have to make such a big hole in the car. So that's where that came from. That's a picture of the one in my Kona. So CCS is now the dominant connector. And CCS, I'll quickly finish with the CHAdeMO. Only one unit has been approved for use in Australia with CHAdeMO that will do vehicle to home as of last month, but there will be very little coming out about CHAdeMO anymore because it has lost the plug war. So what's happening is it is being developed to do V2X, and there is in fact what's called a timeline being developed. So by 2025, 2024, 25, CCS will be fully capable of vehicle to grid. It's already now capable of vehicle to load, and some of the new cars coming out with the CCS plug can do vehicle to load. So the Ioniq 5, for instance, you can plug in your adapter and run your camp. In fact, the Ioniq 5 has a 1.6 ton towing capacity, so you can tow your camper trailer up to Canberra, plug in your coffee percolator and your pot via an induction cooktop and cook up a snag, and or maybe electric barbecue, and invite our esteemed Prime Minister down to enjoy your ruined weekend. And it's likely, however, to be 2025 before the hardware is approved and available here. So if you're interested in that, it's a couple more years, but it is coming. Now, refueling when it comes to electric cars is quite a different model. And I've just thrown this up as an example. For the internal combustion engine, we're used to going from home or wherever to our destinations and making a detour or making a separate trip to refuel at some stage. And that's what the internal combustion engine paradigm is. When it comes to electric cars, it's very different. Our destination is our refueling point. And that's what your mindset has to change to. You don't have to go finding a petrol station anymore. You don't have to make those grey lines trips anymore. You can charge at home, you can charge at work, you can charge at shops, you can charge commonly at a park, at your council buildings. That's what's happening. So once you get out of that change of mode, the key point is refueling paradigm is totally different. And once you get over that, everything becomes a lot easier. So it's a plug and ignore mobile phone model. It's not your find, stop and act as a fuel pump attendant. So the time you spend refueling is to some degree no longer relevant. And that's what the next slide is about. I won't go into great detail on it, but the whole point of it is your choice of what you charge with is dependent on how quickly you want to charge. So if I'm charging at home via PowerPoint, I'm going to get maybe 15 kilometers charged an hour, which is pretty slow, but it's an awful lot easier if you happen to run out of charge, just like running out of petrol, to find the nearest home with a PowerPoint and charge, then try and find the man with the yellow van and get him to bring a 4-litre tin, or to get a find and come back with a 4-litre jerry can, go to a petrol station, get a funnel, refill it, go to the car and get that in. It's a lot quicker and easier, and certainly a lot less messy. Caravan parks, that next one down is a 15 amp outlet. I can get my car fully charged if I get in over just 5 o'clock in the afternoon, walk into town, have a dinner, having plugged it in, and the next morning my car's fully charged and ready to go again. My home charger, if I have just a normal household supply, I can get my Kona recharged in about 9 hours. I only get about 10. On the road, my Kona will charge in about 1 hour 12 minutes, I think. The Ioniq 5 in about, they say, to 80%, 56.5 minutes. For full maximum power rate charger, it's 17.25 minutes. And there's some cars are now coming out with even faster charging. The maximum, by the way, will be 350. The Kona is 220 at the moment, so there will be a limit, those big chargers. But once you're getting down to that stage, the one advantage that hydrogen's been given, which is the refueling speed, and there's a caveat on that anyway, won't be there because you'll actually be able to recharge just as fast. So I'll leave people to, if you want to get more detail out of that, email me for the slides. Key question though is, how fast do I really need to charge? So doing less than 200 Ks a day, PowerPoint will do. And as I said, I gave you those numbers, about $1,500, sorry, 500 installed, because it needs to go back to the switchboard with a particular type of circuit breaker on it. Don't use it as your constant power source. Those 3-pin plugs are never made to do it. And I have a interesting collection of melted photos of melted plugs and what have you. If you're going to be charging at home, and this is the type of thing I would recommend putting in, either a BYO or preferably a tethered lead charger, and that will give me a 9 hours overnight charge of my Kona. And they're about $1,500 up installed, depending on how complicated your charger chosen is. Now, this was a bit of a doozy in some ways, because people keep complaining, my car doesn't, or early in the piece, people have said, my car doesn't do what the test figures say. Well, I'm sorry to say the same applied to petrol cars, and I think there was a court case one recently about this with some Toyota vehicle, Toyota Utes, because they were using the old NEDC, the old European standard, and it's commonly around 30% too high, especially for electric cars. In Europe, they realized that and changed it to the WLTP standard, and it's very close to you. If you're driving mainly city to middle outer suburban use, I comfortably will do around town 480 to 520 in my Kona, and the WLTP number for the Honda Kona, strangely enough, is 484. And so if you're doing that sort of thing, pick the WLTP number. US EPA, on the other hand, does sort of biases their test standard to our middle to outer suburban and regional driving, and it's probably about 10% less. So that's a good number. I've actually written a whole lot of this in Renew magazine, June last year, so edition 155. I've also put a link to that on my own EV Choice website, and you can see those numbers there. The rubber numbers for the Nissan Leaf, for instance, 315 was what it was supposed to have at the 40 kilowatt hour battery. In reality, people were barely getting 240 for it. Okay, flicking to the next slide. The question is, does an EV go the distance? People often say, oh, they get range anxiety. Well, the early days, the first petrol pumps were introduced just after World War I. And that was 25 years after the first internal combustion engines came in. And before that, it was 2-gallon jerry cans. So when our beloved Prime Minister came up with that carefully shellacked lump of coal and later came up with a statement, EVs will ruin the weekend, I didn't get angry. I went, challenge accepted. So I did this tour in September 2019, 7 days, 2,400 Ks. No DC fast charging along the way. I just did that by my overnight stops or a top up if I needed it, which I only needed it once in Geelong when I misjudged the power supply available in Ballarat. I won't go into great depth there, but that's the sort of trip. It was 2,100 Ks, 7 days. Car did brilliantly. It was definitely not your typical long weekend. I was worn out, but yes, they will go the distance. And now, with all the DC chargers starting to roll out, that's what we can see. The NRMA, if you look up in in New South Wales, most of those orange spots, in fact, all of those orange spots are DC fast chargers. I've left out any of the other selections that I could have. This is done through plugshare.com if you want to look it up in detail. And they're all DC fast chargers. The NRMA in New South Wales have run a beautiful network all around there. Queensland government have run it all the way up to Cairns. And if you can see, I actually updated this from 1 month ago, and there's already 3 happening across the Nullarbor Plain. And hopefully I'll be heading across there in June to do some EV training over there. And there might be one slightly slow bit between Adelaide and the first Nullarbor Plain charge, but otherwise I should be able to get there fairly easily.
And
the future, well, 90% of charging roughly is done at home. So as I keep saying, 90% of suburban petrol stations, or particularly suburban petrol stations, better get nervous because their basically bread and butter is disappearing. For that other 10%, a good chunk of it could be workplace charging or your local library or your shopping centre. That's a car park area. Community charging, that's in Cape Patterson and Gippsland there, that they actually have a community charger available. Then you have the closed network at the moment, the Tesla network. That's a picture of the one in Keith in South Australia. They are, by the way, about to open up their network to subscribers. And after that, we can have things like the NRMA network. That, by the way, is probably the worst position DC charger in Australia that I have found, at least so far, because it's a one-way street, so you can't actually turn around. So cars with the socket on the other side are slightly stonkered. And to actually access it, even from my Kona, I had to park partly across the parking bay behind it. And you have the public network, the DC chargers. That's Barnum off and north, just south of the Albury border here in Victoria. Okay, now we're coming to what's available in the world. That's the VW ID3, very popular overseas or in Europe. Won't be brought here, although will come as the Cupra Born later this year. Cupra is a VW sub-brand and basically will come in with a slightly sportier look, but it's exactly the same car, and it will be arriving late this year. And bucket loads of other models coming available overseas. Significantly less here, but we're doing better. So to give you a rough idea, and I won't dwell on these, there's about 2 pages I've got of these available now. So about 4, 8, 12, 16, so 12, 24-ish models, although you can't buy those for love of the money at the moment. You can order them, but they won't turn up until at least the end of this year. A few more that you can buy at the moment. As I said, most of those, however, are in such limited numbers that their waiting lists are blowing out. The Polestar, in fact, they've just in the last few days stopped taking orders because Hertz placed a massive order and Polestar just can't keep up. There are a number of others coming soon. They're the ever soon to come Tesla Model Y, which they accidentally put up the order page last weekend. So they must be very, very close to actually being able to place orders now. Somebody actually did manage to place an order before someone realized their mistake and took it down again. But the deposit went through. So at least one person in Australia has one on order. Number of others there that you can see. I often get asked about the BYD vehicles. I'm going to say BYD wait and see. They tend to have made more announcements than cars delivered. So we shall have to wait and see as what happens there. I said a number of Mercedes models are coming later this year. Genesis are also coming. I just started running out of room to show pictures of them. All of those models, by the way, are available overseas already. I also get the question about, what about the BEV Ute? Or the Butte. As you can see here, there are a number coming. I haven't put I actually took a couple of pictures off in order to add the note about we might get 2 this year. GWM and LDV, both Chinese manufacturers, maybe kept bringing dual cab Utes late this year. I always find the Rivian the most interesting. That was promised maybe late this year, and then it got put back to next year, and then maybe later again, mainly because of the EV policies at the federal level here. It's just like many manufacturers, they're just not bothering. It isn't worth trying to bring EVs to 8 different markets, which is effectively what our Australian states and territories are at the moment. Pardon me. Electric Utes, however, have a number of really, really interesting features that make them actually much better than their petrol or diesel-driven cousins. As several motoring writers who drive these things or write about these things for a living, they're saying it's very hard to go back, having driven some of the Rivians recently. And did I put the Hummer? No, the US in the Hummer has actually been released. It has been for sale for about a month now. I've got to change that one. But the people who've been driving would say it's very hard to go back to a petrol or diesel one because AC outlets to burn. I think there's about, in the optioned up model of the Ford Lightning, there's about 15 of them, delivering about 4.5 kilowatts. So what's that, about 20 something amps, 24 amps. Extra space for loads. Rivian has a gear tunnel, which you can see here has this nice camp kitchen. And Ford there's a 420 litre fruit or front boot that you can put a whole lot of things in. They've actually shown pictures of, packs of golf clubs and things, bags of golf clubs in there. Whisper quiet in the bush. Oh, if you're going out in the bush and traveling through the bush, why would you want to make all that diesel noise? I said you can have the full electric glamping kitchen. Tesla, in fact, are now trying to catch up with their Cybertruck and going to order a camp kitchen to go with theirs too. And another question I often get about is the fuel cell EV and what its future is. Well, there have been a number spoken about. You can't actually buy them here yet. They're all via actually negligible refueling capacity. I think I said, currently lease only. Negligible refueling capacity. There's only 3 or 4 places you can refuel in Australia. There's another one coming soon, but that's the sort of thing that's happening. As an analogy, the start of last century, there were in fact 3 types of cars available: the petrol car, the electric car, and the steam car, all roughly sold in about the same numbers, so about 1/3 each in very, very rough numbers. The steam car sort of fell out of favour because it took 45 minutes to get it ready to go anywhere. The electric car didn't take off at the time, not just because its battery technology wasn't quite as good as it is now, but because you couldn't get an electric charge pretty much anywhere except outside of it. Couldn't get electric charge anywhere except the main CBDs in the world, central business districts, because that's where the electricity. We don't realise just how far electricity has come in the last 100 years. Basically, you couldn't get it anywhere except in a large city, and now it's pretty much you couldn't get it. It's almost nowhere you couldn't get it. I'm trying to say. And when it comes to hydrogen, it takes lots of energy to generate the hydrogen, 3 to 5 times as much as, in fact, as it takes to drive the car the same distance. And I've actually got a slide later on detailing exact numbers. So as a result, Honda and Hyundai have recently ended developing passenger fuel cell EVs. They're still pushing ahead with trucks and that type of usage though. I'm not going to go through these in any detail, except to say that when I revised these slides, I realized that secondhand prices usually, after each year I would be revising them down. I've had to revise them up. The way the car prices are going at the moment, it's nuts. And there were a number of grey imports or private imports. As I mentioned here, the Good Car Company is one that does basically set up some sort of support for them, because normally dealers won't touch the grey imports, and that's one of the problems of buying a grey import. You've either got to have a good mechanic that you know, or be prepared to work on it, or be handy yourself to be able to do it. And as I mentioned, those Hyundai Getzers that basically caused me to give up doing electric car work. There's about 50 of the little things around, and if you're into EV, do-it-yourself EVs, they're a good glider platform to do your own conversion, because a lot of the work's been done for you, and you can put it back on the road as a repair rather than a full compliance job. But you'd have to be doing it yourself. They would cost, if I ever charged the amount of work that I did on them, nobody would ever buy one. They take a huge amount of work. Okay, benefits to the environment and you. I'll briefly run through them. They have no tailpipe pollution. Overall emissions are reduced, and I've got a slide showing that. It's actually in Australia. I've just written a new article, or revised my 5-yearly article for Renew, and I can now say in all situations, in all states, running an EV off the grid is better than an internal combustion engine car, or an equivalent internal combustion engine car. Obviously, negligible emissions of using a solar or subscribe to green power, like the New South Wales public transport. And in fact, Victorian public transport is doing the same now. Reduction in waste coolants, oil, brake, all that lovely stuff to go into the waste stream, no longer, many of them aren't there at all, or just reduced like brake pads, because regenerative braking saves you a lot of work in braking. I won't go into that in any great detail. Suffice it to say that when it comes to digging things up out of the ground, it's not just an EV problem. Anything we dig up out of the ground, we seem to be very good at not taking care of the environment and thinking it doesn't count. Yes, I said servicing costs are reduced. Next slide about that. Electricity is much cheaper. Next slide will cover that. And on the right tariff, fuel may effectively be free. So some numbers. If it's a Renault Zoe, you'd be spending at 20 cents a kilowatt hour running it off peak, $266 for 10,000 kilometers. Internal combustion engine car at $2 a litre, which it is or more at the moment, you're going to spend $2,000. So straight off the bat, you're looking at 1,700 and something. Plus your service savings, minus, mind you, in Victoria, the road user charge. And that still gives you a saving of around $1,750 per 10,000 kilometres. So yes, you do save a lot, and that's worth factoring into the equation of, is it EV yet within your affordability, is your total cost of ownership? Okay, when to consider buying one? Well, I used to put a whole slide of the different models and off I'd go. These days, there's so many models around, but you'll have your own selection criteria. So this is just a set of selection criteria in terms of distance. I run through the AVA website, Australian Electric Vehicle Association. So avva.asn.au, a number of fact sheets, and I actually have a summary sheet of all of the details. So if you want the range or its charging or whatever its price, that sheet's there. And then you can go from there to individual. So expanding that out, that's the sort of detail you get. And then I have a number of fact sheets available through that website as well that you can actually download, and they're all on the same format, so you can compare car to car pretty directly. And if you want to look at this particular talk, or these parts of it as an article, I did this for the Driven almost a year ago, about the time I rewrote it. Used EVs, I've actually done an article in the last Renew on buying used EVs and what to look for, but same sort of criteria you may have. And again, those fact sheets list all the cars that were brought here by the manufacturers since they began in 2011. There are, however, a couple of practicalities you need to consider. The switchboard may not be up to it, so please don't blame the poor car for it. It's just your switchboard or your wiring is probably just about due for it, and it's just tipped it over the edge. Renew Magazine edition 143, or go to my website. You'll be able to download that article. Charging off the street, if you've got that, good. That's me charging my old Leaf through my BYO lead charger. Again, edition 145, Renew Magazine on my website for that. Appropriate tariff, Renew again, or you can, so if you're on the wrong tariff and charging at a very high rate during a day and get a really low rate at night, don't charge during the day, is my short answer. It charges capacities. There are all sorts of options, and there is actually an article in there from Renew that you can go to. You will need to buy probably that lead in particular to use the BYO leads, EVSEs that councils and what have you use. And if you're traveling, a higher power lead is always very handy to have, and I have one of those that I use if I'm actually going interstate. Rarely use it, but I call it the jerry can in the boot. It's just something that if I really need as quick a top up as I can to get me back to a fast charger, that will do it far better than the one that came with the car. Key question I always get though is, when can I afford one? First BEV prices reach parity in a couple of years' time is the predictions, and Tim Storer's 2019 report listed those sort of figures. Bloomberg New Energy Finance have used that sort of number and seems to be sticking to it, even though there's been some rising in mineral prices at the moment due to wars and all sorts of other things at the moment. But we're on that sort of trajectory. In fact, EVs will only be available by the not too distant future. There are a number of countries that have set the dates, and since I set that slide up, EU has now set 2035 EU-wide to be electric vehicle only. As you can see, so even some American states have set a date. So the manufacturers have reached a stage of going, well, we can see the writing on the wall. First to get into the EV space will in fact be the ones that get in there and get the name for it, just like Tesla and Rivian are doing so at the moment. And a number of the really big manufacturers have set some interesting dates. Jaguar will be 2025, so it's not far off. Even GM has set 2035. A number of the other, Ford, for instance, has set, well, maybe not in the US, but in 2030, it'll be EV only. I always laugh when I look at the 2050 Mazda, Mitsubishi, and Nissan, especially when Mitsubishi and Nissan were the very first movers. If they think 2050, they may not be in business anymore because they won't be able to sell a petrol car anywhere, except maybe Australia, unless we have a change of government. To find out some more, here's a few articles and links. The last 4 editions of Renew have had those articles, and I've actually done an update of the EV carbon footprint there. Australian Electric Vehicle Association, you can go there for local events and information, and there's a discussion forum you can join at that link. That you don't need to be a member to join, and you can get all sorts of interesting bits and ask questions there. To find out some awesome Australian websites, I write for The Driven, so I'll do a shameless plug there, although they are a good website for a lot of information. The EV Council, which strangely enough, right on their front page, they say representing the electrical vehicle industry, so they represent the big end of town. There's actually some quite useful information from the manufacturers of both the chargers and the cars there. And if you're after individual personal information, I can help you out a bit with that with my website and my business called EV Choice. A bit of myth busting, and hopefully I've answered most of these questions, but we shall see. Are they overall more polluting? I've got a slide next, but no. Can the grid handle the extra load? I will probably want to have someone to ask that question. So short answer is, provided they're managed, and there's pretty much say a few extra cents a kilowatt hour makes people the discretionary load. So you don't have to charge like an air conditioner because it's hot. You can charge when it's available. So you can have a couple of extra cents a kilowatt if you're going to pay for it during the day, or off-peak rates. I always charge mine off the off-peak rates, things like that. And then when the true smart charging comes in about 2025-ish, 26-ish, and the network can talk to the charger, and then they can be like a controlled load hot water service. And the network can say, well, I need some extra load at the moment. I can, if you set your car to do it, you can get some quite good rates, I imagine, then. Batteries be recycled? Yes, that's the short answer. About 96% recyclable. The systems have yet to be fully in place, but yes, they can be. Do they last? Yes, they do. They're not like your mobile phone battery, which is what everyone seems to think they are, which is not surprising given how bad they are. They've given people a bad taste for lithium batteries, but they are much better battery quality. They are much better battery management systems to maintain the upper and lower voltages and the rates of charge and discharge. So they are built to last. The average, warranty is about 8 years, 70%. So a worst case scenario is only 70% left of your charge or your capacity. 70% of my 480, say 500 to take 150 or 500. If my Kona could still have, at a worst case scenario, 350 kilometer range left in it, and it had less than that after 8 years, I'd get a new battery. In fact, I'm getting a new battery anyway in the next few months, because it was one of the ones that they've recalled due to 16 or 17 fires worldwide. They've pulled, to get a really good corporate image, they've pulled all of those batteries back in, built in that period, and putting new ones in. So I can only take my hat off to Hyundai for that. Cost more than the car? Briefly, the original Nissan Leaf, this was a good urban myth, said about when the original Nissan Leaf started, it was about 60,000 per car, 30,000 for the battery, but the only batteries that were replaced in that first 8-year period were under warranty, so they were free anyway, same as my Kona at the moment. It's now cost about $10,000 to replace it. I'm guessing the Kona is about 32,000 for a new battery at the moment, if you wanted to buy a new one. However, that's generally under warranty, so I'm guessing it'll be the same trajectory for pricing. 10 years time, probably 10, 12 grand for a new battery for it as well. More polluting, I'll say no more. It's just not an EV issue. I don't know why. Some of the trolls keep trying to bring that one up about lithium in the Congo, not lithium, cobalt in the Congo. Cobalt is in fact being phased out of EV batteries. Charge away from home, I think I've answered that one. Battery electric vehicles tow, if they're rated for it. The main reason that a lot of battery electric vehicles don't tow at the moment is manufacturers haven't bothered rating them for it. As an example, the Kia e-Niro and the Hyundai Kona are effectively the same platform. They are the same platform, same running drivetrain. The e-Niro has a 300 kilo tow rating. The Kona has none. Go figure. Some of the later ones, the Polestar and the Ioniq 5 have about 1,600 kilo ratings. Those tow ratings are listed in that fact sheet that I mentioned earlier. EVs catch fire a lot. I'll mention that a bit in the next slide, but no. And does it go the distance? I've answered that one. Those really annoying urban myths I've actually written about November last year, if you wanted to go there. I'll put a couple of slides in about the EV fire. The stats are, if you don't want a car to catch fire, don't buy a hybrid or petrol car. Effectively, electric vehicles, the new car sales sort of figures are 25 per 100,000 will catch fire. That's probably the number of those with the Hyundai Kona failed battery packs. Petrol vehicles, 1,500, and then more than double that for hybrids. So yeah, if you're really worried about fire, don't buy a hybrid. This is the numbers for the hydrogen efficiency, starting with 100 kilowatt hours of renewable electricity. My battery car will get 69 kilowatt hours of useful movement. Fuel cell EV will do, if it's just compressed, so it's just taking refilled near the production facility, if it has a refilling station nearby or attached to it, 23 kilowatt hours or 23%. If they put it in a tanker, compress it and move it to a petrol station like setup, 19%. Not good is all I could say. And nobody, basically they're the numbers that it takes to split the water at the moment. And it's, if you're using water with renewable energy, a lot of hydrogen is currently produced using methane gas or coal. Again, those numbers, I've just redone this figure. So this is the 2022 numbers. And pretty much, well, not just pretty much, it is now true that an EV run in any state grid of Australia, including our nice dirty grid, because it's slowly cleaning up here in Victoria, will be less than a Corolla. 1.5 tonnes of CO2 per 10,000 kilometres for a new Corolla, 1.41 for an EV in Victoria. And that's using a national greenhouse carbon factors produced by the government using their methodology. So the Craig Kellys of this world should really stop saying that only EVs are maybe only good in Tasmania, which, by the way, less than 1/4 of a tonne compared to 1.5 tonnes. Yes, any burning questions, I'll drop the slide sharing. That's evnews@bigpond. If you want to email me at that, I can send you a PDF of these slides. Oh, thank you, Mark. This is the longest I've spoken and the longest I've stayed up for 5 days. So I'm starting to fade, but I'm getting there.
Excuse me. Well, not only was that informative, but highly entertaining. I've seen Bryce before and he never fails to get across the message and do it in a way that's accessible and fascinating. So thank you, Bryce.
Thank you, Mark.
I doubt whether the sound transmission of our musical presentation later will be adequate for you. So I imagine you'll be heading off to bed. Thank you again. And as Bryce said, all of that information, and there's a lot of information available, is available through him from those. We'll supply all of that information. Yeah. So any information that was presented today, you'll be able to access and more of it with the details about all the cars as he explained. So thank you again, Bryce, and we'll thank him again.
Thank you.
Before we go, if there are any questions you'd like to ask now, have a go. We'll try without you coming forward and see whether Bryce can hear properly. So anyone got some questions? Okay, go ahead.
I'd just like to know about the Victorian government's charge per kilometre. Haven't got rate into the haven't they introduced a per kilometre electric vehicle charge in Victoria?
Yes, they have that. It's a road user charge. I mentioned that in the slide on the economics, that even with the RUC or road user charge, that adds about $250 per 10,000 kilometres. It's still a $750 saving. Interestingly, I was at a talk by one of the speakers was the Victorian opposition minister for transport, etc. And to quote him, in case people feel it sounds slightly offended what I'm about to say, his first move, if they get into government, is to drop the road user charge, or as he called it, the EV tax, because to quote him, it is batshit crazy.
Just to add to that, Bryce, though, in New South Wales, where they don't have that tax, they do foreshadow a tax being introduced.
Yes, I didn't bring that. What is the idea ultimately is that all vehicles on the road will pay a road user charge rather than a fuel tax, because obviously people won't be buying fuel anymore. So it makes sense to introduce a road user charge, but introducing it instantly as a disincentive to buying EVs, as opposed to the other states that say they're going to bring it in when either the fleet hits roughly 30% of the new car sales or 2027. That's New South Wales at 2027 or 30%, and they'll review it as it gets closer. So it makes sense that it will happen, but it's to quote our opposition minister, it is the so-and-so crazy to have introduced it straight away. And it's been implemented extremely badly. I don't think there was an EV owner in Victoria that would have a nice word to say about it.
Any other questions? Well, I think, Bryce, that's a reflection on the comprehensiveness of your presentation. It's covered everything.
I'm sure people will have a few other questions, but there's lots of information sources out there, but it's a matter of getting to know where they are. I'm hoping I can start getting a few of those information sources across to people, and people can start doing or help people on their way into making those sort of inquiries and finding out more for themselves.
Yes. All right, well, if that's the extent of the questions, once again, we'll thank Bryce.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to virtually get there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we'll see you again, Bryce.
Okay, we'll see you around. Bye.